All right, we're continuing our study in Wordsworth's epic poem, The Prelude. We left off last time on Mont Blanc with his famous passage in which he reaches this topos of of natural sublimity, which had been a sort of a site of pilgrimage for deists throughout the 18th century, and Wordsworth himself had left Cambridge University in order to see this site and to pass through revolutionary France, with which he was strongly sympathetic, and the whole Age of Reason. So a young man of high ideals, moved much as he imagined Milton would be by the overthrow of unjust tyranny. And one of the things that's really interesting um, to do with the Romantics is to compare and contrast the motivations and the similarities, and but also the differences between the English Civil War and the French Revolution. It's probably a subject that deserves a lecture in and unto itself, but I'm not going to do that here. But there are obviously superficial similarities at the very least, insofar as a king has been opposed and executed by other powers who claimed that he was acting as a tyrant, and a new order was replaced it. In the case of Milton and his peers, a republican government. In the case of uh, the French, a democratic government, or one that claimed to be democratic. And um, the English Civil War, um, religious in its sensibilities, the reasons for it were not just simply those of financial oppression. The French seemed to be anti-religious in its sentiments, but and those that opposed it were most certainly not motivated by their Christian faith in the same way that we would have found that the Roundheads under Oliver Cromwell, Mr. Milton, and others would have been. So significant differences there, but also obvious superficial points of similarity. And Wordsworth sees himself as ushering, as I've said already, a new form of epic, and with it to something of the first great modern poem, it could be said. Although we have noted from the outset that this is an autobiographical poem, in much the same way that Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Confessions were autobiographical, and himself alluding to a previous work that was, crucial to the Western tradition, namely St. Augustine's Confessions. In the same way, Wordsworth's Prelude is in some way an echo of Milton's great epic themes of Paradise Lost and how it was regained. And with that in mind, he does root it in the past, and particularly his own past. But there's something of Wordsworth being not only the pilgrim of this journey, but also the guide of this journey, which is quintessentially modern, and worthy of our note here. Um, Although the subject matter of the Prelude is human nature, and with consciousness and with being, and how we understand our own being in relation to our consciousness and in relation to the memories of our past. These things are all quintessentially modern um, quests for identity, as I say, in which the pilgrim also happens to be the guide of the journey. And in that sense, we find that, as I've said on numerous occasions, we have the beginnings of what becomes a dominant literary um, motif, namely that the hero of these poems is an orphan of some sort. Now, in Wordsworth's Prelude, he is actually orphaned. His father dies when he's 10 years old, and to some degree, he leans upon his own understanding and his own guidance in a way that would be fairly unprecedented, but becomes after Wordsworth a mark of literary, um, not only literary excellence, but basically the dominant mode of literary heroism. So that Dickens' heroes are almost without exception orphaned, and likewise the comic book heroes of fiction and so forth. So this idea that we are having to interpret ourselves to be guides to our own um, pilgrim self, in the same way that Virgil was the guide to the pilgrim Dante. In the same way, come modernity, we are our own guide as well as the pilgrim. And so Wordsworth acts in both capacities in the work, The Prelude, at times flashing back to points within his past in which he describes himself as young, and and having a consciousness that is not fully formed, and at the same time reflecting on as an older man and talking about that distant sense of himself in memory related to himself in a different way. So there's as it were two consciousnesses. There's a consciousness of himself as he now is, and there's a consciousness of himself as he once was. And the attempt is on the poet's part to link those two senses of himself. And so the modern imagination, as Wordsworth describes it, becomes um, um, a substitute for the sort of um, journey described in Dante's Commedia, or even in the medieval morality play Everyman, or in Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, or however you want to see it. It's talking about the growth of the poet's mind, but it's a wholly introspective thing in which there are two parties, but the two parties happen to be the same person. Now, how do this past self and the present self relate to one another? That is Wordsworth's great theme. And in that sense, it is the quintessentially modern poem. It is a self-reflective poem, but it's also, to my mind, a poem in which the self is being not emancipated from the past. That's the wrong word. It's in the sense that he is being coming into being. He's actually being created in the act of describing his past self in relation to the present self and connected through the imagination. So the imagination is a divinizing um, tool. And we'll come to look at that now in the passages in which he, from book 8 onward, um, in retrospect, looks back upon himself, and how, as he says in the subtitle to section 8 here, book 8, how the love of nature leads him to the love of man. So that's going to be our topic today. But he begins book 8. We left off on Mont Blanc. I'm skipping over book 7, where he spends time in London and talks about what happens there in London. They are, to some degree, I think, digressions, not really germane to the great development of himself, which he recounts elsewhere. But book 8 begins with a different mountain, and this is that of Helvellyn. Now, Helvellyn is a mountain, I believe it's in Wales. It's certainly in the vicinity of Wales. And another large mountain, and he is now flashing back, thinking back on the influence of nature and its grandeur upon himself. So here we go. I'll read an extract here, and then I'm going to move forward and not dally too long in book 8, but begins with a question, rhetorical question. What sounds are those, Helvellyn, that are heard up to thy summit, through the depth of air ascending, as if distance had the power to make the sounds more audible? What crowd covers or sprinkles o'er yon village green? Crowd seems it, solitary hill, to thee, though but a little family of men, shepherds and tillers of the ground, betimes assembled with their children and their wives, and here and there a stranger interspersed. They hold a rustic fair. So he begins this 8th book with the description of a country fair, and it's setting in the midst of a mountain landscape, and speaks of it as a place in which he is communing with nature again, and talks about various figures in relation to that, and in reflecting on that that scenery and that landscape. It reminds me of the rural landscapes of his youth, of course, in the Lake District up in the northwest of England. And he concludes with these lines. Let me see here if I can find those lines. With deep devotion, nature, did I feel in that enormous city's turbulent world of men and things, what benefit I owed to thee, and those domains of rural peace, where to the sense of beauty first my heart was opened. So he, in much the same way as he will do in Tintern Abbey, and I would encourage everyone who's watching this to turn to Tintern Abbey, because I think he describes in much briefer form in Tintern Abbey what he also describes here, how his early origins stayed with him even in the midst of urban life, in which the noise and the bustle seemed to drown out and to silence the goodness that he had experienced early in his life, and yet it nonetheless stayed with him in the quietness. When the city grew quiet, it spoke yet to him again, and he claims here that that sense of beauty was awoken in his heart at that point. And he goes on to hail this line, what do we have, 215 now? Yet hail to you, moors, mountains, headlands, and ye hollow vales, ye long deep channels for the Atlantic's voice, powers of my native region, ye that seize the heart with firmer grasps, your snows and streams ungovernable, and your terrifying winds that howl so dismally for him who treads companionless your awful solitudes. There 'tis the shepherd's task the winter long to wait upon the storms of their approach. Sagacious into sheltering coves he drives his flock, and thither from the homestead bears a toilsome burden up the craggy ways, and deals it out, their regular nourishment strewn on the frozen snow. This landscape he describes here is of sublimity. Note the reference to solitude. Note the reference to the howling of the terrifying, ungovernable winds. Note the reference to the frozen snow and its bleakness. And yet these scenes are scenes in which, again, as we've already seen, those scenes of terror are scenes also in which he senses the moral weight of the natural world being impressed upon his young mind. And he connects it now in a way which is characteristically Wordsworthian, not strictly biographically in terms of chronologically correct, but now connecting it with that passage which we saw back in Book 6, where while he was passing through revolutionary France on his way to Mont Blanc, connecting it to Chartreuse. Remember the Chartreusian monastery. And I'll pick it up here. He says that as a rambling schoolboy, 257, thus I felt his presence in his own domain, as of a lord and master, or a power or genius under nature, under God presiding. And severest solitude had more commanding looks when he was there. He being nature. No, I can't be right. Not under nature. A reference to the shepherd, rather. So the shepherd becomes a figure that here is not idealized because of his care for the flock, but more for the severity of the conditions under which he lives, the isolation, the duty, the solemnity, and the fundamental dignity of the man in such conditions. And he says that in that severe solitude, he had more commanding looks when he was there. And when up the lonely brooks on rainy days angling I went, or trod the trackless hills by mists bewildered, suddenly mine eyes have glanced upon him, distant a few steps, in size a giant, stalking through thick fog, his sheep like Greenland bears. Or as he stepped beyond the boundary line of some hill shadow, his form hath flashed upon me, glorified by the deep radiance of the setting sun. Or him have I descried in distant sky, a solitary object and sublime, above all height. And now the comparison, the comparison I'll have you note is as of a Christian one. So it's an object of worship. It's a place connected with worship, and he's compared in Wordsworth's own words, 273, like an aerial cross stationed alone upon a spiry rock of the Chartreuse for worship. Thus was man ennobled outwardly before my sight. And thus my heart was early introduced to an unconscious love and reverence of human nature. Hence the human form to me became an index of delight, of grace and honor, power and worthiness. Meanwhile, this creature, spiritual almost as those of books, but more exalted far more of an imaginative form than the gay Corin of the groves who lives for his own fancies, or to dance by the hour in coronal with Phyllis in the midst. Now these names here of Corin and Phyllis, these are stock names in pastoral literature, the pastoral literature of the 16th and 17th centuries, which Wordsworth would have read. And of course, he's presenting his own sort of pastoral landscape here, and yet he is pointing to something rather different here about the pastoral landscape. So one of the interesting points of study between Wordsworth and the Romantics and their understanding of the significance of nature and the pastoral landscape and the pastoral settings is how the pastoral landscape agrees or has similarities to those of foregoing pastoral landscapes, dating all the way back to Theocritus and his Idylls, and going through Virgil and his eclogues and so forth, and moving on through the centuries, and what Wordsworth and his contemporaries do of this, because what they do with this is they construct I'm not sure if it's the right here, a theology of human nature that comes from the introspective reflection on the native human dignity of the individual, or rather, not the individual, but the autonomous person here. And he says that this spiritual creature was, for the purposes of kind, a man with the most common. Husband, father, learned, could teach, admonish, suffered with the rest from vice and folly, wretchedness and fear. Of this I little saw, cared less for it, but something must have felt. Call ye these appearances. And now Wordsworth is really, through his verse, trying to think aloud about what that significance was. And it is sort of a mystical exploration here. And he's somewhat obscure in his description of it, but that's in part because he's trying to grasp the significance which he deeply feels and to put it into words. And so he goes on, call ye these appearances, which I beheld of shepherds in my youth, this sanctity of nature given to man, a shadow, a delusion, ye who pore on the dead letter, miss the spirit of things. So to his unspoken or unseen critics here, he responds to the perceived criticism that he's imagining things and making it all up. He says that you who deny the validity of the experience that I have so deeply felt, you read but the dead letter and you miss the spirit of things. No, he uses Pauline languages here. The letter killeth, but the spirit giveth life, says Paul, in talking about how to read the Bible with the Holy Spirit as opposed to reading it without the Holy Spirit. And misapprehending or misunderstanding or misinterpreting, we would say, the meaning of the scriptures, which is exactly what Jesus accused the Pharisees of. And Wordsworth likewise is effectively, by implication, by insinuation, and certainly by allusion, accusing those who do not acknowledge the spiritual reality of the shepherd that he himself deeply feels of being something akin to Pharisees. He says, you pour on the dead letter, but miss the spirit of thing. Now, what is the dead letter here? For Wordsworth, the dead letter has got nothing to do with books per se, and certainly nothing to do with scripture. It's on the empirical reality, who insists that the empirical reality of sense that can be empirically verified through the scientific methodology, they miss the spiritual reality of mankind. And they are, in that sense, Pharisees, because they lose the whole meaning of life in the process. And with this, we must find ourselves in great sympathy with Mr. Wordsworth, I think. And certainly this is what makes him so powerful to his contemporaries, and brings in a great romantic movement. He says, you miss the spirit of things, whose truth is not a motion or a shape instinct with vital functions, but a block or waxen image which yourselves have made, and ye adore. So again, the accusation of idolatry. So you don't see that truth has a motion and a shape instinct with vital function. So there's a vitality, something that cannot simply be reduced or quantified, but rather see it as simply a block or waxen image, as the scriptures accuse those who are idolaters of being. And ye adore that block which you have yourselves made. He says, so to the accusation that he's making it up, he returns the accusation, e tu quoque, you also have made something in your own image. And this image has no life, no vitality to it, no spiritual significance to it. And yet you long for spiritual things and continue to worship it. There's the rub. But he says, but blessed be the God of nature and of man that this was so, that men before my inexperienced eyes did first present themselves thus purified, removed, and to a distance that was fit. And so we all of us, in some degree, are led to knowledge, wheresoever led, and howsoever. Were it otherwise, and we found evil, fast as we found good in our first years, or think that it is found, how could the innocent heart bear up and live? If all that we experienced of goodness were to be found in young years, and thereafter only lost, how could we bear it? How could we bear it? And of course, we could not, if that were the only thing. But he says, but doubly fortunate my lot, not here alone, that something of a better life perhaps was round me than it is the privilege of most to move in, but that first I looked at man through objects that were great or fair, first communed with him by their help. So he looked upon mankind in the midst of these grand landscapes, and in their presence he gained help to sense the goodness and the beauty that nature clothed itself in, that also clothed the man that he observed in its presence. And thus, he says, was founded a sure safeguard and defense against the weight of meanness, selfish cares, coarse manners, vulgar passions that beat in on all sides from the ordinary world in which we traffic. Starting from this point, I had my face turned towards the truth, began with an advantage furnished by that kind of prepossession without which the soul receives no knowledge that can bring forth good. No genuine insight ever comes to her. So this is a magnificent passage, and I think he quite ably awakens in our own mind's eye something of the experience that he himself had felt. And this is his great gift as the poet that whose greatness I believe must be acknowledged. Something of the experience of a spiritual sense of ourselves, which, though the scientist, using the methodology of Bacon, of power over nature, reduces nature to something that is inanimate and lifeless and soulless. And Wordsworth says, no. And though ye deny that what I am saying is real and true, I deny that what you are holding to be true and real has any lasting significance. In fact, it's an idol that you yourselves have constructed. And so he goes on with this, and I would actually love to read lengthier extracts from the 8th book here, because I think the 8th book is quite powerful in many ways. And he alludes to Plato, I believe, in line 580, the myth of the cave, the allegory of the cave there. But he says that that he developed this sight of spiritual significance that was awakened in his heart, and which guided him as he grew in his poetic sensibilities. And so I'll conclude with these lines from book 8 before moving on to France, and then before concluding with his retrospective and his summary statement on the paradise that was regained, having lost it in France. He said that add also 6:5. Add also that among the multitudes of that huge city. Oh no, I need to read this little bit because it's pardon me. I cannot fail to read this. Okay, I'm going to, in mid-flight, correct myself here. 6:17. Because this is really important, and he reflects on Adam and Eve as well in this as well. So, 'tis true, the history of our native land, with those of Greece compared and popular Rome, and in our high-wrought modern narratives, stripped of their harmonizing soul, the life of manners and familiar incidents, had never much delighted me. And less than other intellects had mine been used to lean upon extrinsic circumstance of record or tradition, but a sense of what in the great city had been done and suffered and was doing. Suffering still weighed with me, could support the test of thought, and in despite of all that had gone by, or was departing never to return, there I conversed with majesty and power like independent natures. Hence, the place, and he's referring to London here, back which he'd just described in book 7. The place was thronged with impregnations like the wilds in which my early feelings had been nursed. Bare hills and valleys, full of caverns, rocks, and audible seclusions, dashing lakes, echoes and waterfalls, and pointed crags that into music touch the passing wind. Here then my young imagination found no uncongenial element, could here among new objects serve or give command, even as the heart's occasions might require, to forward reasons else to scrupulous march. The effect was still more elevated views of human nature, neither vice nor guilt, debasement undergone by body or mind, nor all the misery forced upon my sight, misery not lightly passed, but sometimes scanned most feelingly, could overthrow my trust in what we may become, induce belief that I was ignorant, had been falsely taught, a solitary who was with vain conceits had been inspired and walked about in dreams. From those sad scenes when meditation turned, lo, everything that was indeed divine retained its purity inviolate. Nay, brighter shone by this portentous gloom set off, such opposition as aroused the mind of Adam. Yet in paradise, though fallen from bliss, when in the east he saw darkness ere day's mid-course, and morning light more orient in the western cloud that drew o'er the blue firmament a radiant white, descending slow with something heavenly fraught. Add also that among the multitudes of that huge city, London, oftentimes was seen affectingly set forth, more than elsewhere is possible, the unity of man. One spirit over ignorance and vice, predominant. In good and evil hearts, one sense for moral judgments, as one eye for the sun's light. The soul, when smitten thus by a sublime idea, whensoever vouchsafe for union or communion, feeds on the pure bliss and takes her rest with God. Thus, he now speaks to Mr. Coleridge, thus from an early age, O friend, My thoughts by slow gradations had been drawn to humankind, and to the good and ill of human life. Nature had led me on, and oft amid the busy hum I seemed to travel independent of her help, as if I had forgotten her. But no, the world of humankind outweighed, not hers in my habitual thoughts, the scale of love. Though filling daily, still was light compared with that in which her mighty objects lay. And with these words, he concludes the 8th book of the Prelude. But he speaks here of a sense of the divinity of mankind and of the of life that cannot be suppressed by any experience, however adverse it is, however much it is denied by the scientist, however much it's trammeled down by manners in the city, however much evil men might evidence the contrary. He sees that there is uh, a unity of man that, in spite of all the differences, connects them as a and their human nature as having an exalted state. That's what he senses here in the midst of all this. And he says it's been furnished by the natural world and the experience of individuals, humble individuals in the midst of that natural world. And those then tend to be the subject matters of his lyrical ballads. And he describes some of those same scenes here. Now, book 10th and 11th, I'm going to, as I say, skip over rather quickly here. But suffice to say that France, having been the place in which he set his earthly hopes at one point, and as I say, left Cambridge in hopes of political revolution and the brotherhood of man, the unity that he just described in the 8th book, which he so deeply felt, he thought that it was being brought about in France. And so he went there and resided there, for that matter. And outside of this, we know that he actually had a passionate love affair with a woman by the name of Annette Vallon, and fostered and had a child with her as well, and was forced to be separated from her. The tragedy of that and the circumstances of that, I think, are not still that well known. But he looks on France now in retrospect, not as he saw it back then, but now as an adult, as a time in which he falls away from the spiritual ideals that he once so strongly held and so strongly felt. So this is a time of a fall. Now, he's not here talking about a fall in the sense that Blake will talk about, the fall of simply experiencing the world and walking away from the original goodness and the perception of original goodness. Not a fall in simply experiential sense, but more in the sense of being deluded by a rational political ideal. And Wordsworth's poetry at this point moves away from what he probably would have felt in his early years, a stronger allegiance to a political agenda and a political program. He moves away from politics as he ages. And remember, we're looking here now at a later version of the poem. The final version of the poem was less political than the earliest versions were. And he looks upon those periods as periods in which he was deluded and lost the spiritual sense of things by connecting his sense of divine justice with social justice and with political programs. And that's because he was horrified by what came out of the French Revolution. Soon after the revolution came the Reign of Terror. So 1795, Robespierre and his contemporaries started executing their opponents, and they themselves were then turned upon for not being sufficiently radical, because once the lawful monarch had been deposed, the question then was, what was the claim for anyone to have legitimacy in rule? If injustice still occurred, the people who were in power would be responsible for that, and they were held responsible. And thus the bloodletting began, the Reign of Terror, which was only ended when Napoleon came into power, and a strong man comes to quell the anarchy and then goes around Europe conquering other countries in a way, and has now taken the French revolutionary ideals in a far different direction than the young Wordsworth ever imagined. Now, the later poets that we will look at of the second generation of romantics, so Shelley and Byron and Keats, they are still sympathetic with those ideals. But Mr. Wordsworth and Mr. Coleridge are not. And for which reason the younger generation, the second generation, despises them for selling out, as it were. So there's a divide between the two, but we'll talk more about that when we get to the later poets. But I'll skip over the book 10th and move a little bit into book 11th. But he talks a bit about how when he first came to France, and I'll just read the first few lines here. Actually, they're in line 75 or thereabouts. He says, "It hath been told that I was led to take an eager part in arguments of civil polity. Abruptly, and indeed before my time, I had approached, like other youths, the shield of human nature from the golden side, and would have fought, even to the death, to attest the quality of the metal which I saw. What there is best in individual man, of wise in passion, and sublime in power, benevolent in small societies, and great in large ones, I had oft revolved, felt deeply, but not thoroughly understood by reason. Nay, far from it. They were yet at cause with me given afterwards to learn, not proof against the injuries of the day, lodged only at the sanctuary's door, not safe within its bosom." They didn't go deep enough. And so as a consequence, he says, he strove to learn, line 101, how far their power or weakness, wealth or poverty, their happiness or misery depends upon their laws and fashion of the state. And so he talks about in these passages how he became swiftly this consulate at the revolution and its ideals, and in fact falls into a period of despair. Let me come to that passage now. 293. But it's largely because he trusted in outward incident, the very sorts of things that he had accused the rational types of looking on the outward things rather than beneath the surface. He himself fell into this by being too politically engaged. And so he says, 295, "So I fared, dragging all precepts, maxims, judgments, creeds, like culprits to the bar, calling the mind suspiciously to establish in plain day her titles and her honors, now believing, now disbelieving, endlessly perplexed with impulse, motive, right and wrong, the ground of obligation, what the rule and whence the sanction, till demanding formal proof and seeking it in everything, I lost all feeling of conviction. And in fine, sick, wearied out with contrarieties, yielded up moral questions in despair." So the result of his insisting on a reason for all things was that he lost the desire for any moral conviction about anything. So he became very cynical indeed at this stage in his life. And so the time in France is a time of great imaginative poverty for Wordsworth. He loses the spiritual sense and the moral sense of human being precisely because he so strongly insists on a reason for all things. And this is an emphasis that Wordsworth makes and is common throughout all the Romantics. They are opposing their sense of the imagination and its spiritual weight with a rationalistic, politically demonstrable outworking of their ideals at all times. But he says, and this sense where he yielded up moral questions in despair, this was the crisis of that strong disease. This was the soul's last and lowest ebb. I drooped, deeming our blessed reason of least use where wanted most. The lordly attributes of will and choice, I bitterly exclaimed, what are they but a mockery of a being who hath in no concerns of his a test of good and evil, knows not what to fear or hope for, what to covet or to shun, and who, if those could be discerned, would yet be little profited would see and ask, where is the obligation to enforce? And to acknowledge law, rebellious, still, as selfish passion urged, would act amiss, the dupe of folly or the slave of crime. Depressed, bewildered thus, I did not walk with scoffers, seeking delight and gay revenge from indiscriminate laughter, nor sat down in reconcilement with an utter waste of intellect. Note the echoes of Psalm 1 here, by the way. I did not walk with scoffers. I did not sit down in reconcilement with an utter waste of intellect. Such sloth I could not brook. Too well I loved in that my spring of life, pains taking thoughts and truth their dear reward, but turned to abstract science. So he didn't walk with scoffers. He didn't sit down with an utter waste of intellect, but he did lose himself in the worst things of all. He turned to abstract science. Again, echoes of Psalm 1 here. Blessed is the man who walks not, nor sits not, right? But his delight is in the law of the Lord. There's no but here. He goes down the path of abstract science, and there sought work for the reasoning faculty enthroned, where the disturbances of space and time, whether in matter's various properties inherent or from human will and power derived, find no admission. Then it was, thanks to the bounteous giver of all good, that the beloved sister, in whose sight those days were past, now speaking in a voice of sudden admonition, like a brook that did but cross a lonely road, and now it's seen, heard, felt, and caught at every turn, companion never lost through many a league, maintained for me a saving intercourse with my true self. So his sister saved him in this horrid state of despair. For though bedimmed and changed much, as it seemed, I was no further changed than as a clouded and a waning moon. She whispered still that brightness would return. She, in the midst of all, preserved me still a poet, made me seek beneath that name and that alone my office upon earth. And lastly, as hereafter will be shown, if willing audience fail not, nature's self, by all varieties of human love assisted, led me back through opening day to those sweet counsels between head and heart, whence grow that genuine knowledge fraught with peace, which through the later sinkings of this cause hath still upheld me and upholds me now in the catastrophe. For so they dream, and nothing less, when finally to close and rivet down all the gains of France, a pope is summoned in to crown an emperor. This last opprobrium, when we see a people that once looked up in faith as if to heaven for manna, take a lesson from the dog returning to his vomit. When the sun that rose in splendor was alive and moved in exultation with a living pomp of clouds, his glory's natural retinue hath dropped all functions by the gods bestowed and turned into a gewgaw, a machine sets like an opera phantom. So he closes the 11th book with a note of contempt for what became of the French Revolution, namely the Napoleon, the sort of the spokesman of the revolution in France, who brings by the French army the French Revolution throughout Europe behind the banner of the French flag. At the end of all that, having executed a king for his absurd oppression of human nature, he then himself is crowned an emperor by a pope nonetheless. And so the tyranny of human beings over other human beings is not only not undone by the French Revolution, it is exacerbated. And so Wordsworth is contemptuous of what became of the French Revolution under the French and through the aims of the age of reason. And so he moves nonetheless, not deterred on his own path for a sort of a spiritual revolution and for the task of a poet. And he referred to that there, how his sister had kept this flame, the sacred flame, alive and kept him to this. And And yet he still has this song, and it will be the song of himself and of nature's own self. Um, and he will now move on to this, describe this in book 12th. And let's move to book 12th now, and then 13th. But 12th and 13th have the same subtitle, and it's the same theme, and it's the main theme that he's been seeking to bring to our attention throughout his prelude, and that is the imagination and taste, how it is impaired and how it is restored. But that it is impaired is impossible to avoid. The imagination is impaired by this life, but and nonetheless it can be restored. The paradise lost can be regained, and he's going to describe how he did it, and how we, the reader, if we've been sympathetic with his depiction of that grandeur that lies within us, how we too can benefit from it. So I will read a few extracts from that here, and we'll go forward from there. So he says, long time, line 1, long time have human ignorance and guilt detained us. On what spectacles of woe compelled to look, and inwardly oppressed with sorrow, disappointment, vexing thoughts, confusion of the judgment, zeal decayed, and lastly, utter loss of hope itself and things to hope for. Zeal to hope for. Not with these began our song, and not with these our song must end. Ye motions of delight. So now he's going back to what he first set off to do right at the outset. Remember when the breeze was blowing at the outset of his poem, the spiritual inspiration that with which the poem began. He returns to that. He said, not with these our song, and not with these our song must end. Ye motions of delight that haunt the sides of the green hills, ye breezes and soft airs, whose subtle intercourse with breathing flowers feelingly watched, might teach man's haughty race how without injury to give without offense. Ye who, as if to show the wondrous influence of power gently used, bend the complying heads of lordly pines, and with a touch shift the stupendous clouds through the whole compass of the skies. Ye brooks, muttering along the stones, a busy noise by day, a quiet sound in silent night. Ye waves that out of the great deep steal forth in a calm hour to kiss the pebbly shore, not mute, and then retire, fearing no storm. And you, ye groves, whose ministry it is to interpose the covert of your shades, even as asleep, between the heart of man and outward troubles, between man himself, not seldom, and his own easy heart. Oh, that I had a music and a voice harmonious as your own, that I might tell what ye have done for me. A reference to the breezes and the spiritual, the still small voice of nature that has accompanied him throughout his passage. And I aver there, of course, to that famous passage where the prophet Elijah, having defeated the prophet Baal in Kings, First Kings, finds not the Lord in the earthquake or the storm, but in the still small voice. Wordsworth, that passage becomes famous in the Victorian period, and a reference to the still quiet voice of God in meditation and so forth. It's interesting how different passages take on a different significance in different ages. And for Wordsworth, of course, that quiet voice of the breeze and the landscape has something akin to a inspirational power, akin to that of a muse I suggested at the outset. And he says that he wishes that his voice was as harmonious as the voice of the natural world and what it did for him. And yet he seeks to emulate it. And he says, the morning shines, not, nor needeth man's perverseness. Spring returns, nor heedeth man's perverseness. I saw the spring return and could rejoice in common with the children of her love, piping on boughs or sporting on fresh fields. or boldly seeking pleasure nearer heaven on wings that navigate cerulean skies. So neither were complacency, nor peace, nor tender yearnings, wanting for my good through these distracted times. And then the famous lines, in nature still glorying, I found a counterpoise in her, which, when the spirit of evil reached its height, maintained for me a secret happiness. And I'm going to skip now forward 170 lines to the famous reflection which he had in the two-part prelude, but he expands on here, namely the reference to the spots of time and what they do. Now, remember, the spots of time are passages which he first describes for us and then reflects upon. And this movement outward and the corresponding move inward and the influence and the reflection upon this continual process of a circular process of reflecting on experience, which characterizes Wordsworth's whole poetic craft. He talks here about how they come to develop the mind of the poet that has been the subject matter of his entire poem here. And he says, line 208, there are in our existence spots of time, epiphanies, I guess we might say, that with distinct preeminence retain a renovating virtue, whence, depressed by false opinion and contentious thought, or aught of heavier or more deadly weight, in trivial occupations in the round of ordinary intercourse, our minds are nourished and invisibly repaired. A virtue by which pleasure is enhanced, that penetrates, enables us to mount when high, more high, and lifts us up when fallen. This efficacious spirit chiefly lurks among those passages of life that give profoundest knowledge to what point and how the mind is lord and master. Outward sense, the obedient servant of her will. Such moments are scattered everywhere, taking their date from our first childhood. I remember well, now he's going to recount one of them, one of these spots of time. I'll get to that in a second. But this passage where these spots of time have been accompanying us throughout our earthly life and retain um, and uplift us and hold us with a sense that there is more to life than the earthly circumstances would belie. But he will talk about his the experience now when he encounters the place where a murderer had been hung in chains and so forth, which I recounted in the two-part prelude. I'll skip over that here, but he recounts that passage or of the passage of the girl who had the pitcher on her head, and she was being blown by the wind, and she was almost leaning into it just to stay upright. The wind was so strong. And it was both of these instances of a power in nature and the moldering effect on the chains and the imagination and the superstition that was attached to the murderer and so forth. And he sees that these had left an influence that is akin to the influence that he was talking about, things that were invisible and yet could be seen and felt. So they're analogies that he is drawing in these experiences. And he says, it was in truth an ordinary sight, the girl with the pitcher. He said, but I should need colors and words that are unknown to man to paint the visionary dreariness, which, while I looked all round for my lost guide, invested moorland waste and naked pool, the beacon crowning the lone eminence, the female and her garments vexed and tossed by the strong wind, when in the blessed hours of early love, the loved one at my side, I roamed in daily presence of this scene, upon the naked pool and dreary crags, and on the melancholy beacon fell a spirit of pleasure and youth's golden gleam. And think ye not with radiance more sublime for these remembrances, and for the power that had left feeling behind? So feeling comes in aid of feeling, and diversity of strength attends us, if but once we have been strong. O mystery of man, from what a depth proceed thy honors! I am lost, but see in simple childhood something of the base on which thy greatness stands. But this I feel, that from thyself it comes, that thou must give, else never canst receive. The days gone by return upon me almost from the dawn of life. The hiding places of man's power open. I would approach them, but they close. I see by glimpses now, when age comes on, may scarcely see it all. And I would give, while yet we may, as far as words can give, substance and life to what I feel, enshrining, such is my hope, the spirit of the past for future restoration. Yet another of these memorials. I'll recount this, but I already recounted it in the two-part prelude. One Christmas time, on the glad eve of its dear holidays, feverish and tired and restless, I went forth into the fields, impatient for the sight of those lead palfreys that should bear us home, my brothers and myself. There rose a crag, that from the meeting point of two highways, ascending, overlooked them both, far stretched. Thither, uncertain on which road to fix my expectation, thither I repaired, scout-like, and gained the summit. 'Twas a day tempestuous, dark, and wild, and on the grass I sate, half sheltered by a naked wall. Upon my right hand couched a single sheep, upon my left a blasted hawthorn stood. With those companions at my side, I watched, straining my eyes intently, as the mist gave intermittently prospect of the copse and plain beneath. Ere we to school returned, that dreary time, ere we had been 10 days sojourners in my father's house, he died. And I and my 3 brothers, orphans then, followed his body to the grave. So he goes from the expectation on Christmas time, he's looking out. And what's he looking out at? He's looking out at probably getting away from his father's house, knowing not in which direction to look, but probably longing to be away. And then his father dies and he loses the thing that he had contempt for. The guilt upon him because of this incident, I think, is what he's describing. But he says the event, with all the sorrow that it brought, appeared a chastisement. And when I called to mind that day so lately past, that when from the crag I looked in such anxiety of hope, with trite recollections of mortality, yet in the deepest passion, I bowed low to God, who thus corrected my desires. And afterwards, the wind and the sleety rain and all the business of the elements, the single sheep and the one blasted tree and the bleak music from the old stone wall, the noise of wood and water, and the mist that on the line of each of these two roads advanced in such indisputable shapes, all these were kindred spectacles and sounds to which I oft repaired, and thence would drink, as at a fountain, and on winter nights, down to this very time, when storms and rain beat on my roof, or haply at noonday, while in a grove I walk, those lofty trees, laden with summer's thickest foliage, rock in a strong wind some working of the spirit, some inward agitations thence are brought, whate'er their office, whether to beguile thoughts, over busy in the course they took, or animate an hour of vacant ease. And thus, he says, from nature doth emotion come. Now, note this word emotion. And I spoke in our tutorial together about the different sense of this word emotion that arises in this period and the significance derived from it, as opposed to the word passion. Wordsworth uses both of the words, passions and emotions, but the passions which is a word that is used of the classical, referring to the not just to the body, but to also the virtues, the things that drive us and so forth, for good and for ill, gives way more and more to emotions. And emotions are something that is native to us that we express. And there's nothing negative about that per se, whereas passions most decidedly has a negative sense in the Christian understanding, and the classical for that matter. The passions are things that need to be tamed and governed and rightly guided, whereas emotions, because they come from us, do not need to be guided so much as they need to be vented and let loose, because of course they express that spiritual sense within us. And here he says, from nature doth emotion come, and moods of calmness equally are nature's gift. Now note that nature is also capitalized here. It's just the goodness that gives rise to this sense of emotion. And he says, this is her glory. These two attributes are sister horns that constitute her strength. Hence, genius, born to thrive by interchange of peace and excitation, finds in her his best and purest friend. From her receives that energy by which he seeks the truth. From her, that happy stillness of the mind which befits him to receive it when unsought. And he describes, from thus he is taught to reverence this power within him, without him, everywhere around him. And he said, line 20, I had been taught to reverence a power that in the visible quality and shape and image of right reason, that matures her processes by steadfast laws, gives birth to no impatient or fallacious hopes, no heat of passion or excessive zeal, no vain conceits, provokes to no quick turns or self-applauding intellect, but trains to meekness and exalts by humble faith. Now, it's fascinating to me that Wordsworth, when speaking of nature and describing it, should describe it in terms that, quite frankly, are analogous to Christian ideals. We see nothing in reference to the same natural world to which Wordsworth refers. In the classical era, a reference to the goodness of meekness or of simple faith. These are clearly Christian words, and not only Christian words, but Christian sensibilities. But Wordsworth does not attach them to Christianity. He attaches them to his experience in the natural world. But note that what he detaches them from is not only Christianity, but any reference to Christ and the cross. There's no sense of the humility, the humiliation of the Lord, but also his passion, the suffering of Christ. These things drop out. And furthermore, there's also no sense, and I've said this a few times already, there's also no sense that he himself needs that sort of redemption. The redemption that Wordsworth offers is the redemption that comes from his imagination. The meekness that is taught just simply by a sensitive interaction with the experiences of life, in particular in the setting of the rural setting of the shepherd and the lamb and isolation. So he's suggesting a sort of that one can live a Christian sort of life without any reference to Christian doctrine, and yet he implicitly refers to it here. So, but it trains to meekness, he says, and it exalts by humble faith. Blessed are the meek, says Jesus, for they shall inherit the earth. And he said, and it holds up before the mind intoxicate with present objects and the busy dance of things that pass away, a temperate show of objects that endure. And by this course disposes her, when over fondly set on throwing off encumbrances, to seek in man and in the frame of social life whate'er there is desirable and good of kindred permanence, unchanged in form and function, or through strict vicissitude of life and death revolving. Would that it were so, but it is not, as Wordsworth suggests that it is here. There is nothing in the natural world that trains us to meekness and exalts us by humble faith. There's nothing that disposes us to love man in social life and to look aside from all of the wickedness, and teaches us to be saintly in our interactions with the natural world. And I've always found it rather extraordinary here. As appealing as the idea is, it simply seems to me untrue. But above all, aside from my comments here, above all, reestablish now those watchful thoughts which, seeing little worthier or sublime in what the historians pen so much delights to blazon, power and energy detached for moral purpose, early tutored me to look with feelings of fraternal love upon the unassuming things that hold a silent station in this beauteous world. And it's the landscape of the mind then. So it's not the vista of the face of God. It's not the heaven. It's not the second coming. It's not the place in which every eye, every tear will be wiped away, in which there will be no more pain or suffering or crying or pain. There's no sense of longing for a heaven in a world that does not yet exist, and yet is being anticipated in the cross and in Christ's sufferings and his message um, of redemption. He is seeing that capacity in the world all around us simply through the mediation of the imagination, which he himself describes in him, and the landscape of the mind that is effectively the paradise within, happier far, that Milton had referred to in Paradise Lost. Wordsworth sees the paradise within as being not an anticipation of future glory, but one of present glory. And so he says, thus moderated, line 48, thus composed, I found once more in man an object of delight, of pure imagination and of love. And as the horizon of my mind enlarged, again I took the intellectual eye for my instructor. So he takes his own eye, the way in which he looks at life. So this is the thing about Wordsworth's concept of redemption. In order to have this faith and this humility, one must look at the world the way he looks at the world, which sounds enormously um, prideful and arrogant to me. But, I think it is actually, and not only does it seem to me, it is so. But consider what he is juxtaposing it to. It's not explicitly to Christianity per se. That's not even in the not even envisioned here. He will refer to that, and we'll look at that in some of the extracts that he speaks to in the prospectus to the excursion and so forth, where he does make explicit reference to the Christian faith and how this is his vision is opposed to that and superior to it to some degree. What he is opposing this vision to, the humility of this vision, is the arrogance and the presumptuousness of modern science, and the emphasis on purely material goods. That's what he juxtaposes this with. And he says, my sense of excellence of right and wrong, the promise of the present time, retired into its true proportion. Sanguine schemes, ambitious projects, please me less I sought for present good in life's familiar face, and built thereon my hopes of good to come. So he returns and concludes with these lines that he book 13 and then in the concluding book, book 14, line 240 here, my theme, no other than the very heart of man, as found among the best of those who live, not unexalted by religious faith, nor uninformed by books, good books, though few, in nature's presence. Thence may I select sorrow, that is not sorrow but delight, and miserable love, that is not pain to hear of, for the glory that redounds therefrom to humankind and what we are. Be mine to follow with no timid step where knowledge leads me. It shall be my pride that I have dared to tread this holy ground, speaking no dream, but things oracular, matter not lightly to be heard by those who to the letter of the outward promise do read the invisible soul. Once again, this reference to the letter and the spirit. And now he's talking about how, again, through the romantic hermeneutic of reading spiritual things into experience, he is presenting a different form of interpreting the world. And thus with romantic poetics comes simultaneously a romantic hermeneutics. Now in romantic hermeneutics, we're going to be directed towards writers like Friedrich Schleiermacher, who likewise talks about the letter and the spirit, and the way of reading the dead letter of scripture in the light of an emancipatory, progressive motif of often political motivations. And once again, Schleiermacher's writing in the age of the French Revolution, it does have a explicit political dimension. And again, in the backdrop of the age of the transatlantic slave movement, one can understand to some degree that is the case, why the political and the worldly aim of overthrowing the oppression, genuine oppression of slavery, is in mind for those who were Christians. Nonetheless, here it becomes a movement wholly divorced from the hermeneutic reading practices of the past and of any guidance by anything other than the mind's own eye here. So Wordsworth proceeds on here, and let me conclude with some of these lines. Yes, where it was. He said, not likely to be heard by those who to the letter of the outward promise, 255, do read the invisible soul. By men adroit in speech and for communion with the world accomplished, minds whose faculties are then most active when they are most eloquent, are elevated most when most admired. Men may be found of other mold than these, who are their own upholders, to themselves encouragement and energy and will, expressing liveliest thoughts in lively words, as native passion dictates. Others too, there are among the walks of homely life still higher men for contemplation, frank, shy and unpracticed in the strife of phrase, meek men whose very souls perhaps would sink beneath them, summoned to such intercourse. Theirs, however, he says, is the language of the heavens, the power, the thought, the image, and the silent joy. Words are but under agents in their souls. When they are grasping with their greatest strength, they do but breathe among them. This I speak in gratitude to God, who feeds our hearts for his own service, knoweth, loveth us when we are unregarded by the world. Now, remember what I said in reflecting upon Tintern Abbey and various romantic poems, this repeated reference to the greatness of the inexpressible. And here, the language of the unexpressed, the power, the image, the silent joys, words are but, he says, under agents in their souls. So there are thoughts that are too deep for expression. And that is the true poetry of Romanticism, is the silent knowledge which cannot be expressed, because when expressed, it partakes of that world of idolatry that Wordsworth despises. So there's something of a Gnosticism that arises, and it's characteristic, again, not only of Wordsworth's whole corpus of poetry, but also of modernity, which likewise talks about the significance of a spiritual sense in mankind, while not being able to identify that spirit with any corporeal manifestation. Also, with it, problematic, it seems to me, is the apology that arises out of this, wherein the spirit is something that is incorporeal and indeed immaterial, where the soul has nothing to do with the body. And these aspects of Wordsworth's sentiments here, and that's that what is the best thing is the inexpressible, and what is the most humane is the immaterial and the disembodied, has grave consequences, I think, for human community, and indeed for the very mankind that Wordsworth exalts as the great subject matter of his poetry. But I will skip over that, and we'll come just simply to the conclusion here. And to some degree, I think we've already been kind of the same sort of conclusion over and over, because he's already articulated what he wishes to articulate. But let me conclude with the concluding lines of this, because we're running out of time. But it's for poetry, it's always worthy of looking at conclusions of poems, because they are part of the structure and character of the lines. But he says that I'll just take a few extracts from this, and then we'll conclude with that. He says, line 63, when into air had partially resolved that vision, given to spirits of the night, and 3 chance human wanderers in calm thought reflected, it appeared to me the type of a majestic intellect, its acts and its possessions, what it has and craves, what in itself it is, and would become. There I beheld the emblem of a mind that feeds upon infinity, that broods over the dark abyss, intent to hear in its voices issuing forth the silent light in one continuous stream. A mind sustained by recognitions of transcendent power, in sense conducting to ideal form, in soul of more than mortal privilege. One function above all of such a mind had nature shadowed there by putting forth, mid circumstances awful and sublime, that mutual domination which she loves to exert upon the face of outward things, so molded, joined, abstracted, so endowed with interchangeable supremacy, that men, least sensitive, see, hear, perceive, and cannot choose but feel. The power which all acknowledge when thus moved, which nature thus to bodily sense exhibits, is the express resemblance of that glorious faculty that higher minds bear with them as their own. This is the very spirit in which they deal with the whole compass of the universe. They from their native selves can send abroad kindred mutations, for themselves create a like existence, and whene'er it dawns created for them, catch it, or are caught by its inevitable mastery, like angels stopped upon the wing by sound of harmony from heaven's remotest spheres. Um, and so Wordsworth speaks of this emblem of the mind, and echoing here to when I'm reading this, almost sounding like the beatific vision that Dante sees at the end of the Paradiso. This he's struggling to describe, is Dante the vision of God in the Trinity, which is inexpressible in his words, and he himself, Wordsworth, is echoing that same sort of vision, the emblem of a mind that feeds upon infinity, but here the mind is his own mind. And once again, if you want to compare and contrast the beatific vision of a Dante, which is inexpressible, with the beatific vision of a Wordsworth, which is inexpressible, the former is describing the inexpressible vision of God, who is a spiritual being who is beyond our comprehension. Wordsworth, on the other hand, is describing his own mind and divinizing his own mental faculties in the process. But when I say divinizing, he's not divinizing himself only. He's divinizing the nature that gives rise to that sense in him. So everything is divine in that sense. Wordsworth, as a later writer describes, Thomas Carlyle says, his writing is marked by natural supernaturalism. And with this is to my mind, a serious the most serious challenge to Christian doctrine that one could imagine. The idea that not that there is no God, but rather that God is in everything and is everywhere, and that everything can be holy depending on the mood or frame of mind with which one approaches it. This is infinitely problematic. It denies the existence of radical evil. It does not suggest any sort of template by which we are to determine that, although in Wordsworth's own writing, it's quite clear that his vision for the inner spiritual and moral life is very much akin to Christianity, but there's no necessity for that to be the case if Wordsworth detaches it from Christianity as he does here. But let me conclude with his discussion of the imagination and his reference to the imagination again. Imagination, he says, 2:05, having been our theme, so also hath that intellectual love. For they are each and cannot stand individually. So the imagination and intellectual love. Here must thou be, O man, power to thyself. No helper hast thou here. No reference to the Holy Spirit. There's no help. Man is his own help. Here keepest thou in singleness thy state. No other can divide with thee this work. No secondary hand can intervene to fashion this ability. 'Tis thine. The prime and vital principle is thine in the recesses of thy nature, far from each reach of outward fellowship. Else it is not thine at all. But joy to him, oh, joy to him who here hath sown, hath laid here the foundation of future years. For that friendship, all that love can do, all that a darling countenance can look or dear voice utter, to contemplate the man, perfect him, made imperfect in himself, all shall be his. And he whose soul hath risen up to the height of feeling intellect, note this phrase, feeling intellect, that's Wordsworth's ideal, shall want no humbler tenderness. His heart be tender as a nursing mother's heart. Of female softness shall his life be full, of humble cares and delicate desires, mild interests, and gentlest sensibilities. So Wordsworth, I would say to some degree, and let me say the concluding words, uh, largely takes Christian language, Christian doctrine, and he emancipates it from the scriptural tenor and the scriptural intent, and secularizes it to some degree and domesticates it, and suggests that the power that of humility, and even the postulate of humility, which is chief, first and foremost, not humility towards other people, but humility towards God, which for me must entail trusting and obeying that God is God and we are not, is usurped by a effectively a sort of a mood, a setting, a type of sensibility towards life, which Wordsworth seems to see as a path of human redemption. And with that, he leads an entire era, which we will describe by various terms, but modernity is probably as good as any. And we'll conclude with that. And we'll go on next time to look at Mr. Wordsworth and what he says in other passages about Milton. But that's it for now.